Okay, so we've got a pretty hefty stack of reports here on European competitiveness. Looks like you're really digging deep into this whole idea of like, what's next for Europe on the global stage, huh?
Yeah, and it's fascinating stuff. It's not just the usual economic jargon, you
Yeah.
know. These reports really try to paint a picture of where things are headed. It's like the whole script of globalization is being rewritten right in front of us.
Yeah, and it feels like a pretty dramatic rewrite, too. I mean, for a while there, it was all about strategic interdependence, right? Like,
Mhm.
we're all in this together, rising tide lifts all boats, that sort of thing. But these reports, they seem to suggest that we're moving towards a much more, well, competitive landscape.
Exactly. And you can see that playing out already, right? You've got the US and China both kind of, you know, putting their own interests first. Take the US, for example. They're investing billions in domestic production, semiconductors, clean tech, you name it.
Trying to secure their own supply chains, basically.
Exactly. Less reliance on others, especially China.
And speaking of China, they're not exactly sitting on the sidelines either. That whole technological autarky thing they've got going on, that's a pretty strong signal, wouldn't you say?
It's a bold strategy, that's for sure. And one that has some pretty big implications for Europe, especially considering how much the continent relies on global trade.
Yeah, and that's where these reports really hit home, I think. They highlight just how vulnerable Europe is given its, high trade openness.
Hmm.
They're basically saying the EU needs to be much more strategic. Like, maybe sometimes it makes sense to keep those trade barriers low, say, if it means getting access to the latest AI coming out of the US.
Right.
But then there are other times when the EU might need to be a bit more defensive, like if it means protecting crucial sectors from state-sponsored competition.
It's about picking your battles, right? Understanding that a one-size-fits-all approach to trade just doesn't cut it anymore. And to really grasp the stakes, just look at the market for critical minerals. China's dominance there, especially in processing, it's a prime example of how this new dynamic is playing out.
They've basically cornered the market, haven't they? One figure that really jumped out at me was that China's use of export restrictions on these minerals has increased ninefold.
Ninefold.
It's a clear signal. They're willing to use their leverage, and that has big consequences for Europe, especially in areas like the clean energy transition.
Yeah. You think about it, electric vehicles, solar panels, wind turbines, everything Europe needs to achieve its climate goals relies heavily on these minerals.
And if China controls the supply, well, they control the game. It's not just about economic competitiveness anymore. It's about energy security, strategic autonomy, the whole nine yards.
It's like we've gone from this win-win idea of globalization to a much more zero-sum game. Kind of feels like it anyway. It's definitely a wake-up call. The question is, how does Europe adapt and thrive in this environment where the rules are constantly changing? And that's where these reports get really interesting because they actually offer some, well, let's call them intriguing possibilities.
Okay, before we get into solutions, you got to give me something here. Right now, it kind of feels like Europe's stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Well, it's not all doom and gloom. These reports do highlight areas where Europe still holds a strong hand.
Okay, I'm listening.
One area is autonomous robotics and AI-powered services. While Europe may have missed out on some aspects of the first digital revolution, like, cloud computing, for example,
Right.
there's a real opportunity here to be a leader in these emerging fields.
And let's not forget, Europe's actually writing the rule book on AI with regulations like the AI Act.
Absolutely. This is a chance for Europe to shape ethical guidelines and standards that could have a global impact. So yeah, while the challenges are real, there are also some significant opportunities here.
Okay, that's a start. But let's be honest, these reports don't shy away from the tough questions either. Like, one of the biggest ones, why is Europe struggling with productivity compared to its global competitors?
Yeah, that's the elephant in the room. It's a complex issue, lots of factors at play. These reports suggest that one major hurdle is demographics. Europe's workforce is aging, and that raises concerns about a shrinking labor pool. Without significant productivity growth, GDP growth could stagnate.
And then there's the whole lost digital decade issue, which keeps coming up. It's like falling behind in areas like cloud computing has created this domino effect, impacting innovation.
It's made it much harder for European businesses to scale up and compete globally.
Exactly. There's that one stat in the report.
You mean the one about no EU company founded in the last 50 years reaching a market cap above 100 billion?
Yeah, that one. Puts things in perspective.
Especially when you think about the US. All 6 companies, currently valued above 1 trillion, all founded in that same time frame. It really illustrates the challenges facing European businesses, particularly in tech.
And it's not just the tech companies, right?
Right.
These reports highlight how this lack of innovation impacts Europe's ability to decarbonize its economy.
It's all interconnected, isn't it? This lack of innovation, it makes it harder to develop and implement the new technologies needed for the green transition.
So, like, we're trying to build a high-tech electric car, but we haven't trained enough mechanics.
That's a great analogy. And it brings us to the heart of the matter. How can Europe overcome these challenges? How do we unlock investment and innovation, not just to survive, but to thrive in this rapidly changing world?
Well, from what I've seen, these reports, they propose some pretty bold, maybe even controversial solutions.
Solutions that challenge the status quo. It'll require a fundamental rethink of how Europe approaches competitiveness in the 21st century. And that, my friend, is a topic for our next installment.
All right, so last time we left off with, well, a bit of a cliffhanger. You mentioned these reports actually offer a roadmap for Europe, not just to catch up, but to actually take the lead in this new global landscape. So let's talk solutions. Where do we even begin?
Well, a big theme that comes up again and again is tackling fragmentation within Europe. You see these reports argue that, this fragmented landscape, the single market, the financial sector, it's holding Europe back from reaching its full potential.
Okay, so for those of us who don't speak economist, what does that actually mean in plain English? We're talking about 27 different countries, each with their own rules and regulations, even different approaches to business. How do you even begin to wrangle that into some kind of cohesive strategy?
Well, it's a massive undertaking, no question about it. But these reports point to some areas where progress could unlock some pretty significant gains. Take the banking sector, for instance. Completing the banking union and reviving securitization. These are two key recommendations that could free up a lot of investment capital.
Hold on. Let's break that down a bit for the folks at home. The banking union, that's all about creating a more integrated, more stable banking system across the Eurozone, right? Sort of like a safety net for the whole region's financial system.
Exactly. A more integrated system is one that's more resilient to shocks, better equipped to support growth. And then there's securitization. Basically, it's a way for banks to package up loans and sell them to investors, which frees up more capital for new lending. The idea is that these measures could help the EU shift away from its reliance on bank financing, which is often seen as less effective at supporting, innovative, high-growth companies.
So less red tape for banks, more money flowing to the businesses of tomorrow. Makes sense. But what about the EU budget itself? It seems like every year there's this big debate about how that money should be spent. What's the take here?
Well, the reports advocate for a more focused, more impactful EU budget, one that prioritizes strategic investments. Instead of spreading the butter too thin, you channel those resources into areas with the highest potential for future growth, future competitiveness.
So less funding for, say, building bridges and more for building, I don't know, quantum computers.
Essentially, yes. It's about backing the industries and technologies that will define the 21st century, scaling up promising tech companies, supporting clean tech manufacturing, funding crucial research and development in areas like AI and biotechnology. These are the kinds of investments that can have a real multiplier effect on the European economy. But it's not just about spending more wisely, it's also about being smarter with regulation.
Now, hold on a second. Are you suggesting that the EU should be making fewer laws in this day and age? That seems a little counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It might seem that way at first glance, but the reports make a pretty compelling case for what they call self-restraint when it comes to legislation, especially in sectors that are facing really fierce global competition. Too much regulation, they argue, can actually stifle innovation and hinder growth.
So give those companies some breathing room to innovate, to compete on the global stage, but wouldn't that create inconsistencies across the EU?
That's where the principle of subsidiarity comes in. The idea is that the EU should only legislate when absolutely necessary and leave more decision-making power to individual member states when it makes sense. It's about striking the right balance between, harmonization and flexibility.
So instead of this one-size-fits-all approach from Brussels, you allow individual countries more flexibility to tailor regulations to their specific needs, their specific strengths. Makes sense. But how do you actually put that into practice, especially in sectors that are critical for Europe's future competitiveness?
The reports urge a shift from a purely cohesion-driven approach to a more strategic competitiveness-driven approach, especially in areas like energy, transport, digital infrastructure. It's about removing barriers to integration, promoting interoperability, incentivizing cross-border collaboration.
So less about just building roads and bridges everywhere and more about making sure those roads and bridges actually connect seamlessly across borders, right? So goods, services, people can move quickly and efficiently.
Precisely. And this applies not just to physical infrastructure, but to energy grids, data networks, even research infrastructure. These reports, they highlight the need for this unified approach that takes into account the interconnections between these different sectors.
Okay, so I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. It's not about these isolated policies. It's about a holistic strategy that connects the dots, make sure all these different pieces work together to actually boost competitiveness. It's almost like thinking of the EU as this one giant interconnected ecosystem rather than a collection of individual states.
Exactly. And like any ecosystem, it needs to adapt and evolve to survive. That means embracing new technologies, navigating the challenges and opportunities of a world that's constantly being reshaped by digital disruption.
So more robots on factory floors, AI-powered medical diagnoses, self-driving trucks on the Autobahn, the whole shebang.
It's not just about blindly chasing after every shiny new technology out there. It's about identifying those areas where Europe can genuinely lead. Areas like AI, quantum computing, advanced robotics. These reports urge strategic investment in these areas, not just to keep pace with global competitors, but to shape the development and deployment of these technologies in a way that aligns with European values.
Speaking of competition, I think we need to address the elephant in the room, which is China. The reports paint a pretty stark picture of their dominance in clean tech manufacturing. We talked about critical minerals, but they're also miles ahead in things like solar panels, batteries, electric vehicles. So what's the play here? Does Europe even stand a chance?
It's a formidable challenge, there's no doubt about it. These reports highlight China's aggressive industrial policies, their willingness to play the long game, and their access to these vast resources. But it's not a lost cause for Europe. Yeah. Not at all.
So if China's playing this like next level chess game, what's Europe's next move? Do we try to beat them at their own game? Or is there like a totally different strategy here?
Well, the reports, they suggest a more nuanced approach. It's less about trying to copy everything China does and more about, playing to Europe's strengths. So instead of going head to head in every single sector, the EU, they could focus on developing a really targeted industrial strategy for clean technologies.
So identifying those like niche areas where Europe can really excel, right? Where we already have that technological edge, or we can, leverage the strengths we already have.
It's exactly. Fostering innovation,
Yeah.
promoting sustainable production, and remember those, strong environmental regulations we talked about. Those can actually be a competitive advantage for Europe.
So you're saying we market European clean tech as like the eco-friendly option, appeal to consumers who are, becoming more and more concerned about the planet.
Exactly. It's about competing on quality, sustainability, even ethical considerations, not just on price. Europe could become the global standard setter for responsible clean tech manufacturing.
Now that's a vision. But what about some of the, let's say, more traditional industries like car manufacturing? That's still a major part of the European economy, but they seem to be, facing some pretty tough challenges.
It's true. The automotive industry is at a crossroads. And the reports, they don't sugarcoat the challenges. Rising production costs in Europe, lagging a bit in certain technological areas, especially electric vehicles, and of course those heavily subsidized Chinese competitors.
So are we saying, like, those iconic European car makers, they're just destined to lose out to Chinese EV startups?
Well, it's definitely a wake-up call. The reports really emphasize the need for a comprehensive plan, an industrial action plan, to ensure the long-term viability of this sector in Europe. And it's not just about throwing more subsidies at the problem. It's about a fundamental shift in thinking.
Okay, so what does that look like? What needs to change?
It's about adopting a technology-neutral approach that focuses on reducing CO2 emissions while still supporting innovation. So think investments in battery production, creating a really robust charging infrastructure, and fostering collaboration in areas like software-defined vehicles, autonomous driving, these cutting-edge technologies.
So instead of like picking winners and losers from the get-go, create an environment where the best tech, the best business models, they can rise to the top no matter where they come from.
Exactly. And this approach, it's not just limited to automotive, by the way. These reports argue that the EU needs to apply this kind of holistic strategic thinking to competitiveness across all sectors, from pharmaceuticals to defense to even space exploration.
We're talking about a massive transformation here, like a complete overhaul of how Europe approaches, well, its entire economy. It feels, I don't know, kind of overwhelming when you think about it.
It's a daunting challenge, absolutely.
Yeah.
But these reports, they also remind us that it's an incredible opportunity. They offer a real roadmap for a European economy that's more resilient, more innovative, and ultimately more sustainable. An economy that can thrive in a world that's being reshaped by, well, by everything, really, geopolitical shifts, technological disruptions, and of course, climate change.
It's interesting, for all the talk about like economic indicators, industrial policies, the thing that really strikes me is the human element. How do we make sure all of these grand plans and strategies, how do we make sure it actually translates into a better life for, everyday Europeans?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
And thankfully, the reports, they address this head on. They stress that a more competitive Europe also has to be a more inclusive and equitable Europe, a Europe that provides opportunities for all of its citizens to participate in and benefit from economic growth and technological progress.
So it's about more than just GDP growth. It's about access to, quality education, good jobs, affordable health care, those social safety nets that protect people, especially with all these changes happening so fast.
Precisely. It's about making sure that the benefits of a more competitive Europe are shared widely, and crucially, that no one gets left behind in the process. And this social dimension, the reports make it clear, it's not just a moral imperative, it's an economic one. A thriving economy needs a healthy, educated, engaged workforce.
It's all connected, isn't it? You can't have a truly competitive economy without a strong social fabric. They go hand in hand.
They absolutely do. And I think that brings us to what I believe is the most important takeaway from all of this. Europe's future competitiveness, it's not just about, economic indicators or technological advances. It's about its people. It's about its values. And ultimately, it's about its ability to adapt, to evolve, to reinvent itself in a world that's constantly changing.
It's about having the courage to embrace a future that will no doubt be more, I don't know, more interconnected, more competitive, probably more complex than ever before, but also a future that holds immense promise.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what these reports really highlight. They offer this, sobering assessment of the challenges ahead, but also this incredibly hopeful vision of what Europe can achieve. It's a call to action, I think, for all of us to engage in this debate, to contribute to shaping Europe's future and ensuring that it remains a beacon of prosperity, innovation, and human progress in the 21st century.